Simon? I actually don't have the time translation thing here.
It is 5 p.m.
Oh, okay, so top of the morning for me, and you're almost ready to crash or play games or drink or flop the video cards on your PC or whatever it is that you're going to go do.
Frolicking in the snow is the plan here because we are knee deep in snow in England, which is not a thing that we normally do. But
Oh, really? Is it that bad
yeah,
right now? Like, how much
yeah,
snow do you guys have?
you could look outside and see it. I don't know. I've not measured it.
What? No, you're supposed to measure the stuff.
We can see it.
No. I understand the context, and I'm not disagreeing with the context. I'm just simply saying, usually there's like a weather report thing that sort of tells you that, like.
Yeah, but I did the old-fashioned weather report of I opened the windows and went, the snow.
Okay.
Cool.
So, and I take it that you're in freak out mode because normally there's not that much snow in.
I mean,
England?
so all the trains
London?
are cancelled. No one can really leave their houses. But then it was also a train strike today, so all the trains were cancelled anyway. So it's kind of same old, same old.
Okay, so nothing new. This is same old London. Okay, cool. All right, cool. All right, so I'm glad things are going great for you then. In that case. Cool. We're currently actually working on just trying to get our LinkedIn live and our YouTube. YouTube's online, and I believe LinkedIn. So give me one more minute, a second, while Simon just waves away or something like that.
How I roll. Mm. Okay, we all good?
We are good. Sorry, I ended up clicking the wrong button on Zoom, so I ended up doing something else completely that had nothing to do with anything. So my apologies. So all right, I think we're ready to start the show. So we are on live on LinkedIn, on Zoom, and on YouTube, just to make sure things are as confusing as possible. So for starters, if you have any questions, please go ahead and post them directly into the chat in either LinkedIn or YouTube or Zoom. So yeah, that's it, really. And because remember, what's today's session? This is the session of, well, Simon and Denny ask us anything. So, you can literally go ahead and ask us anything. So, literally ask your questions here. Let me check to make sure that LinkedIn actually works here today, because we've been noticing some comment issues. So if you folks are seeing any, just make sure you're seeing my little ask the question here in LinkedIn and either like it or respond to it. That'd be great, because otherwise then this will be a really short session because nobody's asking us questions, or we'll get into a little bit of a little war here on random topics just for the fun of it. But just to get things a little bit started, because from last month's session we were talking about GDPR, so that was great, and then the month before we were talking about data mesh, which was great too. So all good things here, but right now we're a little less into those controversial topics, I guess, and it's more a matter of like, hey, do you have any questions relating to I don't know, type 2 SCD2, data warehousing techniques, because after all, Simon and I are both old SQL Server hounds. Hounds, is that okay? I think it is. And then I did want to do some quick announcements while we're waiting, I guess, for some really cool questions, which is, first of all, there is the newsletter on the Delta Lake LinkedIn called Last Week in a Byte. Yes, this is a play off words from John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, but it is different. It's a public font and it's different music, so I should be okay. It's actually, we've basically run the session for, it's a short video clip for about 90 seconds to 2 minutes that just gives you all the cool things that happened in Delta Lake for the last week, because we got so many things going on now that we actually have to go ahead and start giving a weekly newsletter now. And so, for example, we have a cool story about Delta sharing that's actually being used in the US CIS, United States Citizen and Immigration Services, basically governmental agency using Delta sharing, which is pretty cool. Let's see, what else is there? There's also other cool call outs to two maintainers to Delta Lake. There's the Delta Lake maintainer who is Will Jones, and also Robert Pack. We're congratulating them. So small things like that we are actually calling out. And the next session of the Last Week in a Byte newsletter comes out literally right after this show that we are doing right this second right now. So meanwhile, anything else anything that's interesting for you? Excuse me, Simon, as I basically choke out my own tongue, apparently. So
No, I don't think so. I'm slowly getting over jet lag from last week. I kind of know what country I'm in.
that's good.
That's about where I'm at, really. Just, and finally actually making some videos again. I've had some flack on the interwebs. I've been doing too many conferences, not enough YouTube videos. So I put a video out today, and there'll be more videos going now because I'm actually at home and can do that. But
I'm curious. So what was your topic for this most recent video in that case?
So today was Unity Catalog, in that the lineage elements finally went GA.
Yes,
which is cool because you can do column level lineage now, and you can click on a thing and said, where did that come from and what tables does that to go into? And you could kind of force that to work in some other tools, but it took like a huge amount of work. It was very painful. So the fact you can just go run a load of queries and it scrapes column level lineage is so cool. So yeah, that's what I was rambling on the internet about today.
That's cool. I'm glad you're back, because after all, you were too busy traveling. So was it? You were in Vegas last week and you were in Copenhagen the week before. Yeah. So yeah, are you
bouncing around the UK as well as over in Bristol for a bit and then Taunton and just basically it's like the whole lockdown thing of going, I don't need to leave my house. I can just record lots of videos, turned into, you don't get to see your house anymore.
Cool.
But it's fine. I'm now refusing to leave my house for the next couple of weeks. Well, except to go and do Christmas things and, drink mulled wine in London and hang around. Nice things. That's my plan for at least the next 4 weeks. I'll be okay.
Rock on. Okay, we actually do have some questions coming in, so let's go ahead and start tackling some of them. So first question is from LinkedIn from Paul Wilson, and said, thanks for your amazing content. So good. That's great that you like our content. The world of Spark is relatively new to me. He's been doing it for about 6 months, I believe. And Spark config, along with repartitioning and clustering, is actually quite complex. And what are some of the top tips for ensuring that I always have the best configuration, no matter the data size and task? So that's his context. Any thoughts that you'd like to chime in, or anything that you'd like me to chime in on first? Your call.
Yeah. I mean, so there's the two separate parts there, right? So
yes, very much so.
Any Spark config versus any table config.
Correct.
And I generally try and steer clear of doing any Spark config if I can. Because why? Come on.
Well, you don't want to go into the dungeon doldrums of all the different Spark configurations to get everything perfectly right. Come on, really? Why not? It's fun.
Because generally what we've seen is, because as the runtimes change, as the Spark kind of versions change, a lot of the old configs we always used to do are no longer relevant.
Exactly.
So yes. I went to a client kind of that I hadn't spoken to for a year and a half and kind of had a look, and there's loads of things that they'd done to fix some problems around forcing the max size of Parquet files, changing, kind of how many rows in a row group, all the low level config you can do in the Spark config to control how things get sped out. And I was like, a lot of that is kind of fixed from adaptive query execution,
correct,
from dynamic partition pruning, from a load of stuff that's come in later versions, that if you've kind of got it hard coded as your Spark config, it's easy to fire and forget Spark config. I think that's my problem. If it's not in your code, if you're not seeing it there and it's just something you've put on your cluster and then you don't really worry about it, it's really easy for that then. It's once optimizations go in and once the engine changes, once Catalyst engine has some more things that actually fix what you put that original fix in for, I've seen it too often to have all of those things actually get taken out. And honestly, it's rare you need to worry that much about the Parquet dictionary size, the number of rows that go into each Parquet file, unless you're doing something really, really, really huge and precise and time critical. The majority of the time, you don't need that level of fine tuning. So whilst it's intimidating when you first start and you look at all these configuration options and you go, oh, wow, what do I even put into these numbers? I'm usually pretty happy saying the defaults are actually okay for a lot of it. because they'll change, because the engine will take care of it. And then you're always at least using, again, as the question was, what are you always using the best config for the data, like sort of, no matter the data set size? If it needs to be able to handle anything you throw at it, then don't hard code it for a particular problem. Tends to be my mindset.
So actually, let me add to that because we're still on the Spark config. So for starters, everything. So Paul, for everything that Simon called out, absolutely right. The thing that I would absolutely add to it is like, just like Simon was implying, you can do those Spark configurations often, typically at the cluster level. So if you're going to do them, at least do them at the session level, so that at least you can see them right from the get-go. But saying that, he's, oh my goodness, yeah. Like if you're using a more current version of Spark, often those configurations are no longer necessary. In fact, typically when I'm running Spark, like for example on my machine, like my local machine, or just if I spin up a GCS or AWS or Azure instance of my own, where I'm basically using like a Docker instance when I'm not using like one of the managed services, literally I think the only thing I can configure is, well, how many like basically how many cores is my driver and how many executors and what cores and what memory am I using there? That's the extent of all I'm really configuring, because that's really tied to your hardware. Like, I mean, how many cores does your driver have? Okay, configure accordingly. How many nodes, executor nodes do you have, and how many cores and how much memory does those executors have? Okay, again, same principle. Outside of those things, honestly, I'm not usually configuring anything unless I have a very specific reason. And since you're just starting off, like you noted, that's relatively new, I wouldn't bother trying to go super deep into that, just because you really would go ahead and more times than not, I'll end up doing configuration that basically would hose yourself in the future. So, for example, I used to do specific configurations. I even forget what those configurations are now. Around data skew, right? Just to handle data skew. Well, Simon called out AQE. Spark 3.0 plus includes adaptive query execution, or AQE. And in that process of AQE, it actually solves the problem of data skew. It actually subpartitions the data behind the scenes and automatically takes care of that for you. So you're going like, okay, well, cool. So because of that, so the configuration I had was actually literally fighting with AQE. So how do I solve my problem? Basically, to solve the skew problem, I literally just removed my configurations and removed my custom code, and AQE handled the whole thing for me, right? And so if you really get into itty details, I would definitely start with the table configurations, like the repartitioning or clustering first, which we'll talk about in a second, and then afterwards, if I do care about things like maybe size, like the actual file size. And even then, like, unless you're dealing with streaming, even when it comes to batch scenarios, they often will actually like basically choose the right sizes for you anyways. So yeah. So I guess the next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and talk about table configurations before, and Paul's actually done a follow-up question, which is great, but let's answer his question about tables versus we go back to his next question. Okay. So
yeah. And
all right.
Tables is the same answer, right?
Honestly,
it's the other answer, but using Delta. So I used to do lots of fiddling around of trying to say, okay, so I've got my data frame. I need to repartition around a certain thing because I want to control how many files this is going to create. I need to repartition to a certain number, or repartition around a certain kind of column in Spark. Try to really, really work out how many files I'm going to get so I can like control the size and all that stuff. And I just don't bother anymore. Partitioning, sure. But then if I've partitioned and I end up with more files inside that partition than is really optimal, well, I'm going to run an optimize command on it anyway. So I'm going to clean that up. And I'm going to worry about actually taking whatever was written out into exactly the right size of files and exactly the optimal configuration. But that's a maintenance job I can do later. I don't need to have a load of Spark settings. I don't need to have that configuration for performance inside the flow of my data frame. I can almost separate the business logic, what I'm trying to do, how I'm trying to derive the data, away from how do I tweak it to make sure it's in the optimal state for performance. And it's nice having that abstraction and going, get the job finished, get it down. People can start reading it. People can start using it. And yeah, the first people to get to it might find it's not the quickest thing to do because it's not in the optimal state. When I next get around to running an optimize, I can clean that stuff up. So yeah, partitioning you need to think about. But then below that, yeah, you're talking about more optimizing. You're talking about, Z ordering. You're talking about the additional things you layer on top, which don't necessarily have to do with what you're doing in an actual data frame to get stuff kicked out.
Yeah, exactly. So again, exactly to Simon's call out. Excuse me. What it boils down to is that when you use optimize or optimize Z order and the upcoming Bloom filter indexes that will be included in Delta OSS, it's already in Databricks, but it's on the roadmap. Go.delta.io/roadmap. We're a little behind schedule on that one. But the context basically is that it'll restructure and organize the data in a particular way, but also allow for space filling curves. I always love saying that, to basically go ahead and run your queries more efficiently. So that way you reduce the number of false positives. What do I mean by that? Basically, when Spark or any other system that's actually able to use Delta is able to go ahead and say, hey, do I actually need to look at this file? That's basically what it comes down to. And the less number of files that Spark actually has to read, the more faster it will go, because it doesn't actually have to spin over additional nodes, additional executors, or waste an executor just to even look, hey, do I need to look at that file? It basically avoids doing all that. And so this is where Delta Lake itself will actually help solve a lot of those problems with the optimize Z order. Underneath the covers, there's also things like when just ordinary optimize does, which is basically compaction, which is often when you write files, maybe you actually created too many small little files. Okay, you'll hear words like "hey" or concepts like, "Okay, make sure your Parquet files are from somewhere between 256 megabytes to 1 gigabyte in size, depending on the type of core, processor, saturation, network saturation that you're currently dealing with." And so,
I don't sound like that.
All right, not you specifically, but maybe me in the past. How about that? Okay, there. All right, there you go. So okay? That's what I would respond. Sorry, I apologize, Simon. But the context, nevertheless, is with all of that, the idea is that, well, instead just run optimize. Literally, just run an optimize statement. It'll take care of that for you, and then basically it'll group all those files together, and you're good to go. Which makes your life significantly easier. So, and which is what we're going for here. Yeah, God forbid we actually try to do that.
The little bit of nuance on Paul's question of going, will it partition efficiently 1 versus 200 versus like 10,000 Parquet files is slightly different, because you've got the idea of partitioning in that it writes to separate files, and then you've got the idea of Spark partitioning, in which it creates the subfolders, and you have, you look in your Spark folder and you'll see year equals 2020, year equals 2021, year equals 2022. It's not going to partition for you. You need to design a partitioning structure, and as soon as you've got data of a certain size, you need to partition that, just for efficiency of inserting into it, managing it, updating only a subsection rather than the entire thing, getting people to subscribe to changes. There's lots of reasons why partitioning is nice. And then the number of files that are created inside that partition, we don't really think about, because we can optimize that separately. So you do need to worry about partitioning. You don't really need to worry about the number of files if you're using Delta, because then you can optimize it. And partition strategy, favorite partitioning strategy, is that something nerds have? I've got one.
No, I used to have a favorite partitioning strategy, but honestly, the key one that I typically still do or just default to is literally date, and that's it. And the reason why is less of the querying, though obviously it does have some it definitely has some context, because when you're querying the data, basically you typically query the most recent day's data anyways. Like there's basically almost like a curve, a drop down curve that basically says, the vast majority of data is queried basically for the last month or so, and then subsequently it goes down and down the grade when it comes to all the other months, basically, for you to query that data. Which is but the actual reason is not even so much about the querying. It's actually because of the processing the data, right? Because as I'm doing ingestion, as I'm inserting data into the system, the reality is I need to go ahead and actually understand, like, I'm going to insert most likely typically in the most recent partition, like the most current partition. So any of the older data that I can partition off, I can go ahead and literally just say, forget it. I don't need to touch that. Like typically, for example, when you talk about like web analytics, we'll say that even if you accidentally was to receive data from anything that's older than a month, it doesn't matter anymore. Like you actually will no longer care about that piece of information. So now, of course, each business is going to run this slightly differently. Okay. So yeah, it's cool if you go ahead and actually say like, oh yeah, I'm allowed processing data from 3 years ago. That's great. But not all scenarios require that. That's all I'm just trying to get at. So because of that, then often you can do things like well, in that case, I'll lock down that partition. I'm actually not going to allow processing against that data, or I'm going to put this in a different bucket, or I'm going to put it in like Glacier, or some archival process, basically. So that way you're allowed querying it, but you're not allowed touching it. That's where the management aspect of basically querying and also maintaining that data becomes really interesting. And so that's why you actually care about stuff like this ultimately. So
yeah, I mean, same on our side, right? We tend to partition by date in the earlier parts of the lake automatically. So you talk about your bronze, your silver, your raw base, whatever you want to call it, those things, because that's an ETL mechanism. That's about going, well, take those updates, crash the current month, rebuild the month, whatever update pattern you happen to be doing, probably date-based. The only thing we do is, depending on the size of it, we might have it configurable so it's either year, month, or year, month, day. And that's the only bit of advice I've got around like date-based partitioning. We tend to include the hierarchy, the full hierarchy in there. So year, Y, year, month. So, 2022. What year is it?
2022. 2022, my friend.
Exactly. And then 2022, 12, 13 is the current date. So we can include the full date range. And that's just because if people are doing like range-based queries, going, can I get the last 30 days? Can I get all data between those 2 points? It's really awkward to build that SQL query when can I take that year, but this day, if it's past that point in a month, and from that point in a month, and you end up building this complex thing to try and hit those partition things, no one ever hits the partition successfully. And just we found that doing year, month, day is just a more natural thing for people to query on. And then you can join it to other tables and use dynamic partition.
Honestly, folks, this is just him being European, insisting that us Americans change the way we do our dates. Isn't that correct here?
Absolutely. Do it in a sensible, hierarchical way.
As much as I would love to debate him for the sake of being a North American, he's actually completely right. And I've been doing the exact same thing as he's suggesting for years. Like, this is not even like specific to Spark. I've been doing this in we've been doing this in SQL Server and everything else, just for the exact same reason. So yeah. Cool.
Okay, question 1 done.
Yeah, question 1 done. We didn't rat hole like we usually do. Yeah, okay. So there's a question on the line here from the Q&A panel here in the Zoom side of the house. So we'll go switch over to that. By the way, for those folks in LinkedIn and YouTube, if you still have any other questions, go ahead and please chime in. Otherwise, that will wrap it up because we don't want to make you guys suffer and listen to my awful voice. But the question is, in Databricks, the first time you run an automated ETL job and the target table does not exist yet, do you script the table creation in the same script, use Terraform, or do something else? I'm looking for best practices. Okay, so it's a great question. And there's actually, unfortunately, I believe Simon and I can rat hole on this one as well. So do you want to start first, or you want me to start first on the rat holing here?
I mean, I can go on a meandering little wander on here. Yeah,
I know. That's why I'm asking. Do you want me to do it, or do you want to do it first? I'm cool either way.
I mean, I'll say that there's two answers. There's the brand spanking new answer, which is what I think people are going to start looking at, and there's the answer of how we currently do it. Now, the majority of times when we're talking about tables, we're doing a merge, and you can't merge into a table that doesn't exist. Therefore, yes, you have to create the table in advance. It's annoying. I'd love the merge functionality to go, oh, it's not there. Oh, I'll just create it for you. That would make my life so much easier, but it doesn't. So yeah, absolutely. We ended up writing a little table creation function that basically builds up a table creation script in Spark SQL and goes, create table if it doesn't exist. Here's all the things. Now, that felt like a bit of a workaroundy hacky thing originally, because what we wanted is our tables just to be created based on the contents of the data frame. So I can just hydrate an entire lake and go, generate 1,000 tables. You'll figure out what the schema is when you receive the data, and then just create the tables according to what you've got. And that's how we used to work around things. But as Delta's evolved, to the point when you've got loads of things that can only really be done on the table creation step. When we're creating, Bloomfield indexes, we're creating identity columns, we're putting constraints in, we're putting comments on the various columns. All those various different things need to be done as part of the table creation script. And so there's the need for that initial table creation function. Actually, you have to create the table up front so that it actually can be done properly and start to get some of these more advanced modeling aspects that are being enabled by Delta. So whilst it was a necessity because we wanted to merge originally, now it's something where we can put in and start to harness a load of the extra advanced features by taking advantage of it. So that's kind of where we are now. Going, yeah, we create a function. We just, whenever you're about to merge into it, whenever you're about to write into it, call that function first, build up a script that says create the table if it doesn't exist, add in any of those additional column level functionality things you can, and life's good. Then there's the what's new, what's recently changed, and this makes all of the old school SQL people so happy. In that I've not had a go of it yet, I've not tried it, but Irwin Data Modeler is now on Partner Connect, so you can actually build out your proper crow's feet data model. You can have it all. You can fill your data modeling desire, make it look as old school as you like. Then you can hit go and generate the SQL and create those tables. So there's kind of like the people who used to build lots of warehouses and have a data model, deploy that data model, and then configure their pipelines to fill that data model can work that way. Well, it's not been working that way for a long old time, but that's a new option you now have that I've not embraced. But it's now an option and it's fairly new. I think it came out last month before.
I think so. So, by the way, to provide people context, so for many of the newer people into the data warehousing space. Now, when I say data warehousing, I'm not actually talking about the tech itself. I'm actually talking about the techniques. Okay, so when we like a lot of people talk about data warehouse, the software itself, like SQL Server data warehousing. That's just because both Simon and I are Microsofties, or used to be Microsofties, or whatever, close enough. So we can talk about the data warehousing, the actual technology or software service, or we can talk data warehousing, the techniques, the methodologies. And so what we're talking about in this case is the methodology, not the actual software itself. So because we're talking in that context, Irwin in the old days, okay, as in when I started working in data warehousing, both the technique and the software back in like the late 90s. So I'm very much dating myself now.
Don't worry, it's not changed in the intermediary time.
No, true. But the point is that, like, if you're madly into doing data warehousing techniques, then Irwin is your absolutely what you would go do. You would design the system, completely go bonkers, and exactly what Simon was calling out. You have this wonderful logical and then physical layout of what those tables are supposed to look like, what the primary key and foreign key relationships to them are, what indexes, columns, all these other things are. Boom. And then you go and say, all right, now click, boom, all these SQL queries are generated for any of these databases, and bam, now you have your wonderful data warehouse created by multiple tables in this wonderful star or snowflake schema that was perfection. And then absolutely, as soon as you did it, then you would change half of it because of whatever reasons, right? But the context basically is that if you're able to plan things out, this is a very powerful tool that you can basically leverage. Part of the reason we've not leveraged something like this isn't because of its inavailability, though. Part of it's because of the fact is, though that's true, part of it's just because of the fact that we ourselves are typically, because we're running so fast, exactly to what Simon called out, wouldn't it be just better if you could just run a merge statement, and if the table's not there, it just automatically creates it for you, and then you're good to go? And incidentally, I would just simply, no joke when I say this, go ahead and create an issue on Spark and Delta specifically for this, because there were ongoing debates a while ago, specifically on should we allow that to happen. And honestly, the main reason we didn't allow that to happen is because we caught too many scenarios where basically people would then, oh crap, no, I didn't mean to create a new table. I meant to merge another table. And so it was basically that debate back and forth of whether it made sense or not to actually address that. And so Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'd probably go create an issue specifically to address that. But not either way, as Simon called out, the reality for this type of scenario when it comes to like what do you want to do, there are multiple techniques that you can come into play that actually allows you to go ahead and basically generate these tables from the scratch, like whether you're creating functions of your own self, you create a Terraform script. And honestly, though this seems like a long-winded answer, the reason's long-winded is because a lot of this has to do with your environment, and a lot of this has to do with also what you know how to do. So, for example, if you're a Terraform script expert, yeah, why not? Just spin up a Terraform script that actually defines the tables from the get-go. If anybody who's on this session today, you've never heard of Terraform, no, don't do that. Build a function instead that you're more familiar with. And that honestly is your best practice. The key thing, and I think everybody, if you're going to get anything out of this, is to document it. Write it down somewhere so people recognize the fact that you're doing this. Please.
Unity catalog's kind of self-documenting. It's fine.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, and
fine. Document your code.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, yeah. I was about to say, I'm like, I hope you're being sarcastic here because yeah, okay, good.
Very much so.
Okay, good. All right, cool. There's another question about the Databricks ecosystem. So normally we don't typically answer too many of them, but it is an ask us anything. So we'll try to actually make it shift back to also talking about the wider Delta ecosystem as well. But it is a great question from Ricardo on LinkedIn. So let's go ahead and tackle this one. Okay. So Ricardo, his question is, does anyone use the Databricks Connect plugin for development? I really prefer to use an IDE to write code instead of Databricks notebooks due to better code integration, IntelliSense, Git integration, project organization. So I'll start if you'd like. Basically, we have Spark Connect coming out really soon, and I would 100% start giving that a try. We actually will have a separate session specifically for Spark Connect early next year to talk about that. This will allow for better IDE integration, basically. Now, saying that, there already is a VS Code plugin. Okay, that was released, I want to say announced actually last week. I actually don't quite remember. Okay, thank you. I'm like, because I know Gerard Barocco from Pico, right? Him and his team had created an initial VS Code plugin, I want to say a month and a half, 2 months ago. And then it wasn't on purpose. Databricks actually had been working on one in parallel. But the context basically, nevertheless, is that, yes, whether it is talking about the open source Spark ecosystem a la Spark Connect, or we're talking about the Databricks specific ecosystem, like the VS Code plugin, there is a massive push by both the open source and the Databricks, both sides, to basically have much better integration with existing IDEs. And if you're wondering why VS Code, it is actually literally the number one IDE right now, like unequivocally. I cannot explain to you like how weird it is for me to say that, because I used to use Visual Studio itself, where I'm old school, so that means I had these 20 DVDs that I had to put into my machine to go and install just Visual C#.
Because you hate memory and you don't want your local dev environment to have any memory left after you've
exactly.
started.
Pretty much. Yeah. I hated it that much apparently. So, but nevertheless. Okay, sorry. As you can tell, traumatic experiences from my past. But nevertheless, the context is that there is a lot more work being done for integration with CI/CD platforms, Git integration definitely already, and basically just integration within the IDE. Anything else that you think I forgot to add, Simon?
No, nothing. All makes sense to me. The only thing is, I was in Vegas when I saw the announcement for the VS Code extension. Is it just for the Databricks SQL side of things? So it's like interacting with the SQL endpoints and the SQL data warehouses? Or is it just cover the board of lots of different things? I've not actually looked into it.
I haven't either.
Oh, good. All right. Question answered. We don't know. I'm assuming I'll have to do a video on that very soon. I'll go.
So Simon's going to do a video on that soon to answer his own question, because since I'm usually sitting in the Delta Lake side of the house, as it is anyways, I know it sounds funny. I realize I am a Databricks employee, but it's really, this is hilariously funny. Part of the reason I have Simon here is because he can actually answer the Databricks questions. I often don't know them. which is a horrible thing to say as a Databricks employee. I do want to call that out. So, yeah. All right, we do have another question, so we can shift to so that way I can avoid what I just said. In a DLT pipeline, this is Delta Live Tables. In the UI, you define a target DB schema. So a table defined as raw would go to target raw. Okay, fair enough. Can I define the next DLT table in the pipeline that would land in a silver clean, for example? Yeah, I mean, so Jonathan, basically the context for what you're trying to do is you're trying to basically use Delta Live Tables to go ahead and generate basically new tables down the stream, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we had a similar question last time in that it's they want to populate different databases, the tables into different databases using DLT, and you can't currently do that.
Correct.
So it would go into a single catalog in your Metastore, and you just get different. You'd have to currently label it as raw table, silver table. You need to prefix those names at some point,
right? But it wouldn't go into a separate database. It could only go in the same one, in essence, quote unquote. But the idea is that you could label them accordingly. Jonathan, this is definitely one of the things where we would advise you to definitely, and we'll help too. So don't get me wrong, but to go ahead and definitely ping your Databricks SA and then basically say, yeah, we should be supporting that now, because we actually, none of us are, we're all in agreement, basically. I mean, yeah, like, yeah, that's it. Like, we really should do that.
The other thing, which I think is still not done enough, I didn't check with the UC lineage announcements from yesterday.
Yesterday.
I think still Unity Catalog and Delta Live Tables can't talk to each other. So eventually you'll need 3-part naming in those targets, but they don't currently coexist. I'm sure when they do, hopefully team, they'll be looking at that to figure out how those things talk to each other. But yeah, currently it's a figure out a naming convention, and it all lumps into the same database for now.
Yeah, for now. But again, Jonathan, please do ping. We're glad to back you up on that one easily enough. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's it for questions today. Anything else that you want to add? Otherwise, we'll cut it short for today. But though it still was 37 minutes, so it's not too bad for us. So,
yeah, no. Unless there's any last minute questions people want to throw in, then yeah, we can leave it there.
Okay. Like we're just waiting, seeing. Oh, okay. We do actually have more questions. Okay, cool. All right. So then we're going to ask anybody. If you have questions, please put them down, because both Simon and I are lazy, so we actually don't mind leaving. So if you have questions, go ahead and chime them in here right now, so that way we will actually address them. Okay.
I need to go play in the snow. If there's no questions,
exactly. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, yeah, like I got to go make coffee. So like we have priorities here. Like really, it's yeah. So okay, all right. But let's. I was about to go into a diatribe of coffee, but I just realized that's not something I should do. So let's go ahead and ask Pavel's next question. Thanks for Delta is great. Woohoo! Yeah, glad to hear that. Except actually everything on the lakehouse side is a pleasure to work with. However, the challenge is to get the data to lake, aka ingestion, into the tier 1, i.e. bronze, i.e. raw. Okay, is there any best practices for a multi-tenancy model? How do you do the same ingestion by 2000? Okay, Pavel, I want to answer your question. I'm going to start, but I also want, I'm going to start by actually asking you some questions. Okay. So for starters, when you're talking about multi-tenancy, are you talking about the context of multiple regions, multiple environments, multiple clouds, multiple clusters? Like multi-tenancy model in this case can actually mean multiple things. So I'm going to ask you that question. I'm going to start addressing some of them anyways, but I'd love to know specifically what you're trying to do. Okay. Irrelevant of platform, whether it's Databricks, yes, I work for them, or on Azure Synapse or EMR 6.9 or whatever. Okay, the general rule is that when you're talking about that second part of your question, the ingestion by 2000, you should theoretically, not even theoretically, should be able to just spin up more nodes to handle the load. That's really what it comes down to. The whole reason Spark became so popular was this idea that I could have linear distribution, add more nodes, can process more data, or query more data. That's what it boils down to. So unequivocally, I would start with that, which is saying, is whatever infrastructure you have, I don't care which managed platform or which OSS platform, if you're spinning this, doing a DIY or spinning up yourself, are you able to go ahead and actually be able to say, let me go ahead and now go from 10 nodes to 50 to 200? Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is then, when you do that, is the underlying infrastructure that you're trying to do actually able to support that? Now, for example, if I'm doing this in the cloud, presumably, like, I'm just going to choose AWS just because I was working on that like literally before we started this particular session. But the same thing is just for HD Insight for Azure. I know. Ouch. I know. Sorry. I'm sorry. Trauma is coming back again. Okay. So for Azure or for GCS, okay, the context is basically that you could basically have S3 because it's specific for AWS. So literally you add prefixes to the file system in order to be able to basically help with the distribution. And so now S3 is actually able to send back the information just as quickly as your system is about to beat the living daylights out of it, which is great. So if you have, like, for example, you're doing this as an on-prem environment, my literal response is, that's great. Well, HDFS can actually handle it, but you make sure you actually have a direct router link between whatever your compute and whatever is storing storage, because otherwise you're going to do the equivalent of the DDoS attack on your own systems. Okay, I am guilty of that, very, very guilty of that. So don't do that. But so in the end, it should presumably be about that. Okay, which is to say, like, okay, can I have can I spin up Spark? And can I increase the number of nodes to it? And is the underlying cloud, underlying infrastructure going to be able to handle it? So because of that, I'm presuming cloud now, okay? Which then, okay, that's great, which means it should be able to handle it, provided you can get enough spot or regular instances to be able to basically query against that. Now, another aspect of multi-tenancy is basically the idea that, okay, am I going to be able to, and I'm going to pick on AWS now, mainly because there's actually a weak point there. Now I'm going to do that because if I want multiple drivers, multiple clusters to basically go ahead and write to the same Delta table at the same time, okay? So that works perfectly fine in Azure. It also works perfectly fine in GCS. And also works perfectly fine in HDFS. It does not work for Delta Lake, at least. It does not work perfectly fine for S3 because S3 lacks a transaction consistency called put if absent. It's lacking put if absent transactional guarantees, which means only a single driver is allowed going ahead and actually writing it at the same time. Now, when I say driver, the problem actually isn't the writing of the Parquet files, the data files, which is the vast majority of the work. It's actually writing of the JSON file, the transaction log itself. If by chance the transaction log is supposed to go right at the exact same time. So in other words, two jobs that are basically writing to the same Delta table at the exact same time, but they both end up trying to write to the same JSON file, okay? The same metadata at the exact same time. There's a possibility that client 2 will overwrite client 1, thus corrupting the system. Now, of course, you're going like, oh my God, this is bad. It is, except, okay, in Databricks, how you solve that problem is that Databricks already has an S3 commit service that's already included. And we're currently working on making that open source, by the way. So that way, any client that interacts with a Databricks environment can actually go ahead and access it, not just Databricks SQL or Databricks Spark or whatever. Any client that's interacting with Databricks actually can make use of that. But then you ask, hey, how do I do it in open source? Well, we've been doing this for a while, actually, since Delta Lake 1.2. There's the S3 DynamoDB log store. Basically, DynamoDB acts as a conditional write. So that way, when client 1 and client 2 are both trying to write to S3 at the exact same time, the log itself at the same time, basically what ends up happening is like, oh, okay, DynamoDB says, yes, you're allowed writing it, and no, you're not. And the writing actually isn't even writing the actual JSON file. The JSON files are actually appended with a prefix, a GUID, and a temp file, like a temp naming convention. So they actually don't ever overwrite each other. It's just more that rename point where they'll say, okay, I'm going to, as a conditional write, let me rename that file into .json. So then it becomes part of the official Delta transaction. So how often does this occur? Not often, by the way. Even though I'm telling you about all of the stuff, when we did the tests, I want to say about 3 years ago now, or 4 years ago now, there was 4 chances out of 10 million that it could happen. Okay. So it is not exactly a common occurrence, but because we wanted to guarantee this idea of multi-tenancy, multi-transaction, multi-drivers, that's why we built, again, in Databricks, the S3 commit service, and in open source, the Delta World, basically the S3 DynamoDB log store. And so that's actually being built for other systems as well. So Pavel, I hope I've answered your question, because again, multi-tenancy can mean slightly different things, but at least I believe I answered mostly the cloud related and the multi-driver related. So anything else that you think that needs to be added here from a diatribe perspective, Simon?
I mean, I just do it in a different way, honestly. Generally, whenever we were dealing with data acquisition or data integration issues, we tend to abstract it. We try and decouple it from the rest of our Spark ecosystem. So if you're talking about going into your bronze layer, we normally have like a landing blob or a landing, some kind of cloud storage, which is not formally part of our lake, which doesn't have the same structures, doesn't necessarily need the same older securities, but that people can then just throw files in. So you're talking to your different vendors, you're giving people, tokens so they can write to a certain part of that landing. You're treating that as a place for people to send files from various different child companies, various different subsidiaries, various different vendors, whoever it is. And you can have a whole spree of these different landing zones separated out if you need to do separation of storage for your multi-tenancy. But we just treat that as that integration layer, right? So it doesn't have any rules. They can throw whatever files in there. It's not going to go, that's the wrong structure, and throw things back. It's deliberately a decoupled, easy landing space for people to throw files. And then we'll tend to do file streaming into that first raw area, especially if we're using Databricks, we're using things like autoloader. So that we're then working on going from that landing space into there. So you're not worrying about how is the Spark cluster, is it going to overload my relational server by throwing too many threads at it? Is it going to overload an API? Is it going to load all these different things? And you're not worrying about doing the networking from wherever your Spark servers, like all the different clusters are living, through to whatever your source systems are. So we just tend to do whatever cloud we're using, whatever service we're using, have whatever cloud native data movement tool. In Azure, you'd be using something like Data Factory with a self-hosted integration runtime. You might be using things like Fivetran to go and do some things. Various different ETL tools are good at getting data and land a file somewhere. And then from there is where I tend to kick off the Spark jobs. So honestly, I don't have to worry about all the things that you were mentioning, Denny. That's like, just give me some files and I'll work with the files. If I have to go and get the files myself, I'll just use a tool that is for moving files rather than for doing the big, chunky cloud-based queries that Spark is.
No, very true. And that definitely a good call out to Autoloader. It solves a heck of a lot of problems exactly on that. So, and by the way,
number one fan.
Cool. All right. So actually saying this is a good way of time for us to wrap up. I did want to do two call outs. Eventually I'll be able to speak English. First, thanks to Chris Fregley. He actually went ahead and called out the blog post that I was actually talking about in terms of the S3 DynamoDB log store. So I propped it into the chats. I forgot to do that also for Zoom, but I'll do that right now. And the second thing is that there was a question about, can you still watch these videos? Absolutely. This is a LinkedIn video, so it actually stays in the Delta Lake LinkedIn, so you can always come back to it. The other thing to call out is that we also prop them in the Delta Lake YouTube, which is go.delta.io/YouTube. So you can just go there. There's actually a playlist called Simon and Denny's AUA. So yeah, by all means, go ahead and you can watch these videos and make fun of us if you like. So saying that, I think that's it for today. If you have any other questions, we'll be back here next month. But meanwhile, you can also go ahead and ping us on the Delta user Slack, which is go.delta.io/Slack. So yeah, we're sort of very predictable this way. So yeah. Anything else, Simon, before we go?
No, I think that all sounds good. Again, just thanks everyone for the questions. And yeah, I guess we'll pick a topic for next month. So if there's any topic suggestions that we should do, then feel free to fire that over, add some comments, ping us directly, add it to Slack. Yeah, let us know what you'd like us to be talking about.
So, for example, Chris Fregley has hinted that we should start having guest appearances. You know what? I think that's a great idea, and in fact, Chris, ping me. We should figure this out. Chris Fregley is an old friend, so I apologize that we're just reconnecting online like this. But yes, absolutely, yeah, yeah. You thought you'd never ask. Okay, so anyways, please go do chime in. Let us know if there's anything you'd like to do, or be direct like Chris and say he wants to be on the show, which works for us too. So and we'll see you next month. All right.
Alrighty.
Perfect. Thanks very much, everybody.